All right, last week we were talking about the rights that Paul had. And we spent a lot of time talking about what he had the right to take and the right to do. We talked about money, family, any number of things. This week the concentration is going to be more along the lines of, even though he had these rights, the rights that Paul voluntarily gave up. Because he gave up all of these rights in this situation in Corinth. Now if we start in verse 15, we can see in verse 15 it says, "But I have used none of these things, and I am not writing these things that all may be done so in my case. For it would be better for me to die than to have any man make my boast an empty one." There's a couple of things we see in here. The first thing we see is, when he says, "I've used none of these things," he's saying, I had a right to family, I had a right to money, I had a right to all these different things. I deliberately didn't do it. One of the things you have to remember is, in Corinth, the situation and the context was, if you came to Corinth as a religious person, the odds are you were selling idols or doing something else, you were raising money, you claimed you could, contact the dead or whatever, but it was a money game to a large degree. And Paul didn't want to be seen as one of these money grubbers. So because of that, Paul voluntarily said no. That's the same reason he didn't take a family, he didn't take a wife and things of that nature, so that he could pour all of his energy into sharing the gospel. The other thing here that's critical and a little bit confusing the way it's written, when Paul talks about I'd rather die than do this, what's he talking about? What he's talking about is saying, first off, I'm not telling you all these rights that I have and that I'm giving up to try to shame you into giving them. Because if you think about it, if somebody walks up, I've got a right to this, I've got a right to that, I've got a right to, but you haven't given me any of those things, your first thought is probably going to be, okay, what's he want? Paul's making it clear here, he's not trying to shame them into doing something. He's saying, I am voluntarily ceding these rights and not going to ask for them for the glory of Christ. And not only that, when he talks about I'd rather die than do this, what he's actually saying is, if I were to take and allow you to pay me, everything that I just said would go out the window. So I don't want to do that either. Now the other thing also we have to see here is that it's not talking just about money, and also it's not talking about just about money. There's a lot of things here that Paul gave up besides money. We mentioned family, but there's a number of things he gave up. And when we also look at verse 15, it says, you see, and I am not writing these things that it may be done so in my case. Sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing here. One of the things that comes up also is Paul had said that he is not under obligation to any man. Now that's talking about not just money, but it's talking about any number of things. One of the things we've got to look at here is that when he says he's not under obligation, if you think about it, the obligation would have been taking a paycheck. And you think, well, that doesn't make sense in our context. If I get a paycheck, that means I worked for it. And what Paul is saying is, even though he would have worked for it, the obligation would have been that it would have made him beholden to someone. When you think about it, and I don't mean this as a criticism in our culture, but when a pastor takes a salary from a church, he's putting himself under an obligation in two ways. Number one, he's putting himself under the obligation of, I got to show up every Sunday and preach a sermon because I've got a contract to do that. Not only that, he's also putting himself under obligation because he's got to play by their rules, because they're the ones that have hired him, they're the ones paying him to do this. So what Paul is basically saying here is, nobody's got a hold on me. Nobody can make me do anything. I'm doing this all for the glory of Christ. Also, when we talk about obligations, sometimes we have to remember things like houses are an obligation. If you bought a house, if you've done that before, and you get this statement every month and it says mortgage and what you got to pay, you realize real quick you've got an obligation. So what Paul is trying to do here is saying, wait a second, I don't want to be bound to anyone. I want to be free to do whatever I have to do to spread the gospel. Now, one of the questions that comes up here is, does that mean that Christians shouldn't take loans or shouldn't buy houses? No, it's not talking about that at all, because the reason is the context in Corinth made it clear that that was not right for Paul. It's not talking about us today. It applied in Paul's situation. There may be reasons not to do it, but it's not a universal command to never do it. Now if we move on to verse 16 and 17, in verse 16 it says, "For I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion. For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel." It sounds a little weird when you start thinking about these words. I'm under compulsion. I have nothing to boast about. Woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. Sounds like there's a threat against him, but that's not what he's saying. When Paul says he has an obligation to preach the gospel, think about this. Christ died for Paul's sins. Christ saved Paul, who was chief among sinners. Christ gave him a mission. The reasonable duty of Paul was to follow that mission that God gave him. And he was under a bind to Christ, essentially. By the same token, Paul was doing it voluntarily. And one of the things we can see here is that when we do it voluntarily, we're going to get, I think, more reward than if we're doing it against our will. So he's saying, I'm not under compulsion, for woe is me if I do not do this. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward, but if against my will, I have stewardship entrusted to me. Either way, Paul's going to end up preaching the gospel. But the question is he going to enjoy it? And not only is he going to enjoy it, how much reward is he going to get for it? If it's voluntary, it's going to be more of a reward than if it's under compulsion, I believe. And I think that probably follows for us too. If you think about it, when I was young, my mom used to say, go clean your room. I didn't like that. I was never good at cleaning my room. But if I decided I wanted my room clean and went and did it myself, it was the same result. But I enjoyed it more. It wasn't so much of a burden because nobody told me, go clean your room. I think that's kind of what Paul's talking about here. He's also talking about then, he says, but I have a reward. Okay, the question is, I thought Paul already says he wasn't going to be paid for this. What's he mean, I have a reward? He's not talking about the financial payment here. The great reward he's talking about is twofold. Number one, I don't know the specifics of it, but I do believe that after death, God rewards Christians. Now, many people have said, well, you're going to do this with these laurel wreaths, and you're going to do that, and all these different things are going to happen as far as how Christians will be rewarded. You know something? I have no idea if that's true or not. It's actually probably a mistranslation of the Greek to even talk about that. But I will say that I think somehow Christians receive a reward, and I really don't care how it happens, because you know something? That's going to be after I die, and God's going to work that out. That's funny. People always want to know tell me about heaven. Well, we talk about heaven sometimes, but you know something? I spend very little time studying heaven. The reason is, God's got that. I'm not going to have to worry about what heaven is. I want to worry about what's happening here on earth. I think the same thing is true of rewards, even though I think there is a reward for believers. However, I think even more than that, what Paul's talking about is the internal reward for doing what he should be doing. It feels good to serve God. It feels good to use your gift. One of the things I did years ago was, for 10 years, I sang in the National Christian Choir. I found it very rewarding, but I never received a dime. In fact, I had to put money out to do it for traveling and things like that. So the point is, the job itself becomes the reward. I think that's what he's probably talking about here more than anything else in this, as far as being under a compulsion to preach the gospel. He's got to do it no matter what, but he can enjoy it while he does it if he sees this as something that's voluntary. In verse 18, Paul says, what then is my reward? Then when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge so as to not make full use of my right of the gospel. Again, the words seem a little confusing here if you just read them out of context. When he's talking about what he's able to do is preach the gospel without reward, that is his reward, or without charge, that is his reward. He's able to be a part of God's plan. And when you're part of God's plan and you know you're a part of God's plan and you're working for God's plan, that is a reward that you can actually sense. And in addition to that, to know that he's not making full use of his rights is a way for Paul to say, you know something? I know that I'm doing this for God. I'm not doing it because I got a 6-figure income or something like that from the church. That wasn't Paul. I was told a while back by a local pastor, and I don't know if he's right or not, I've never looked. He said, in general, for a medium-sized church, a couple hundred people in this area, generally the pastors are making at least a 6-figure income in the Washington, D.C. area. I don't know if that's true or not. I've been told that by a couple of pastors, actually. The point is that I'm not knocking what they're doing, don't get me wrong. But when you can do it without taking money, there's more of a reward to you, I think. Not financially, but there's something where you're not obligated, you're able to preach the gospel freely, and you're not worried about, is my salary going to be cut next week because of something I said? If you guys fire me tomorrow from being an elder, great, I didn't lose a dime. Not that I want you to do that, but the point is, there's no loss of financial rewards. And I think that's what Paul's getting at here, is that he will do anything it takes to win others to Christ, period. It doesn't make any difference what it is, he's going to do it. And he's going to do it without charging for it. Again, we don't want to be in a spot where it looks like we're preaching the gospel just so that we can earn a living or just so that we can make money. It comes across wrong in a lot of cases. Now, if we look at verse 19, Paul said, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, that I might win the more." Okay, again, Paul using what I would consider confusing language. I'm free from all, therefore I am a slave. Well, that doesn't sound right, does it? It sounds like one of those oxymorons or paradoxes or whatever you want to call it. But that's what Paul's talking about here, and the reason we're getting to this is when he says free from all, he means no one has a hold over me because of financial reasons or family or anything else. No one. There is no one that can say, you've got to do this because we're paying your salary. By the same token, he's made himself a slave to all because he's a slave to Jesus Christ, a slave to the gospel, and he's willing to reach out to any and all in order to bring the gospel to people, in order to teach people the gospel. He's a slave to do anything for his master. And again, we normally have a negative connotation to the word slave. Yet every believer is called a slave of Christ. I have no problem calling myself a slave. Not what usually you hear in a PC culture or something, but that's what we are. And the point of the slave is to do what the master says, and the master has a goal for each one of us to be winning people to Christ. Now, I don't mean necessarily even through evangelism. What I mean is doing your part, whatever that part is, so that we're reaching out, so that we're reaching people and teaching people and discipling people. And not only that, if you are doing that, and you're doing it for Christ and not for yourself, you're going to be seen. You're going to be noticed. And I mean that in a good way. I don't know if anybody else did this, but at 4 a.m. yesterday morning, I woke Linda up and we went downstairs and we stood at the sliding glass door in our kitchen and watched out our sliding glass door. Now, just in case you don't know, we don't normally do this at 4 a.m. But we did it so we could watch the rocket launch. Because about 100 miles southeast of here, they launched a 2-stage rocket that's going up to supply the International Space Station. And when that thing went up, even though it was 100 miles away, you saw it. There wasn't any... Yeah, it's funny. Okay, are we going to be able to see this? Is it going to blend in with the stars? When that thing went up, you noticed. I mean, there was no question. There's a red streak coming up in the sky. There's, again, 100 miles away, and anybody looking at this thing would have known it. They didn't have to know there was a rocket launch. They may have thought it was a UFO. I don't know what they thought. But anybody would have seen this and go, hey, something different is happening right there. You know something? If you are truly working for Christ, being a slave to Christ and a slave to others, teaching the gospel, preaching the gospel, or doing support for the gospel, whatever it is, you will be noticed by other people. And I don't mean pride here. What I mean is people are going to say, hey, that person is different. I need to know why. Non-believers will see it, and believers will see you and go, you know something? Maybe I should change my life because of that person. That's the kind of beacon that each one of us needs to be. We need to be a rocket, not a rock. We need to be someone that people will look at and go, you know something? They're not glorifying themselves, they're glorifying Christ. And if you do this, it's going to help reach other people and teach other people. Now, if we look at verse 20. Paul goes into more detail about how to do this, and it says, to the Jews I became a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. Again, a real tongue twister if you're trying to read this thing. But number one, he's saying, when I'm visiting with the Jews, I can speak their language. I can tell them how I had incredible zeal in persecuting Christians. I can tell them that I know the law better than they know the law. That's what Paul was saying here. For those who felt they could earn their way to salvation through the law and the Old Testament, again, he knew the law, he could speak the law, and then he could show them how the law was pointing toward the Messiah. Not as a way to save themselves, but as a way to be saved through the Messiah that was coming. Paul was willing to modify himself in certain ways in order to reach other people. And we're going to get to that in a second. If we continue in 21, it says, to those who are without the law, as without the law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. Did you notice the contrast there? In verse 20, those who are with the law, and verse 21, those who are without the law. You couldn't have a much bigger contrast than a legalistic Jew at that point in time following the law to try to earn his salvation, and a Gentile who knew nothing of the law, who worshipped idols and did whatever before salvation. Yet Paul could reach out to both groups equally well, even though those two groups appeared to have nothing in common with each other. He could speak their language. And when he says law of Christ, by the way, he's not talking about a new law as the old law. It's an idiom that he used to place himself as a servant of Christ, whatever Christ wants to do. But no matter who he was speaking to, his goal was to win people to Christ. Period. That's his goal. And not only that, if you look at how he did it, he taught people the gospel, even the unsaved. He would teach them about what the Bible actually said to show them why they needed a Messiah. But he would cater that teaching to their background and understanding so they would understand it. Now, one of the things I think we want to clear up here also, actually, let me go to verse 22 first. It says, he continued, to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I may by all means save some. Again, just another group that he's willing to go to. And I think the reason, why doesn't he say to the weak I become weak, to the strong I become strong? I have a personal opinion here, maybe wrong, because generally people notice the strong. They don't notice the weak. I think what Paul's saying here is, I'm willing to debase myself and to be seen, I don't think necessarily physically weak, but people who are seen as weak, and yet I'm willing to be like them and talk to them and reach out to them in some way or another. As I said, it wouldn't be saying a lot to say, like, to the rich and famous, I'll be rich and famous. Paul didn't have to say something like that. It would have been kind of ludicrous if he did. But I want to dig into this for a minute here, because this becomes very, very confusing. I become all things to all men. Okay? The reason I want to dig into this is because many, many churches have applied this today, and I think they have thoroughly screwed it up in most cases. Becoming all things to all men means we give up our principles. We give up our doctrines. We give up who we are. Because after all, I don't want to offend someone. I want to be all things to all men. One of the things we've been seeing is, in the 20, 30 years ago, the big news was the seeker church. Well, you know something? A lot of the churches that became seeker churches are actually either folding up or changing their model because they're saying, you know something? It didn't work. It brought people through the door. Did it change their lives? If you're converted in a true conversion for Jesus Christ, it will change your life. There's no record in the New Testament of someone walking in the door and saying, I now become a Christian, walking home, being a Christian, and nothing ever changing. It's not the way it works. It's not works that save you. But if there's nothing in you that changes, I think you need to re-examine, were you saved? In Sunday school, it came up, Linda was talking about her brother. He was saved 3 times before he was saved. Yeah. 3 times he went forward, conversions to Christ, everything, and not once was those an actual conversion. When he was 40 years old, his life turned around dramatically because he became saved. I think we have to be careful of that. It means also becoming all things to all men, speaking their language. But it doesn't mean gutting our doctrines. When Christ went out and sat with prostitutes and shared the gospel with them and had meals with them, you know something? He communicated with them on a level they could understand and reach, but he never partook in their sin. And that's the difference. A lot of times becoming all things to all men means go ahead and do the sin, don't worry about it. You want to go to a strip club and hang out with a guy so you can witness to him because God's going to lead me? No, that's not what it's talking about. And yet I've literally heard that in certain churches today. It also means not compromising on doctrines such as universalism. There are churches out there that are trying to win everybody to Christ by becoming all things to all men by telling them everyone is saved eventually. No. Some people are going to heaven, some people are going to hell, and the only difference is those going to heaven have put their faith and trust for their salvation in Jesus Christ so that His blood can cover their sins. Those going to hell have not. And it really comes down to that, and it's that simple. You've got other people who have taken the prosperity gospel we've talked about a lot before. The reason I keep bringing that up is because it's so prevalent today, not only in this area, but if you look at television, most of your evangelists are prosperity gospel. That is not the gospel. You can flip on the television, you can put on Joel Osteen, you can put on Kenneth Copeland, you can put on Creflo Dollar, you can put on Benny Hinn, you can put on Peter Popoff, and I could go on and on and on. And you know something? They are not preaching the gospel. It's that simple. They are a false gospel that is prosperity gospel. If you listen to their words, what you find out is it's not the gospel of Jesus Christ, but another gospel of a completely different type. The reason I bring that up again is because being all things to all people doesn't mean modifying the Bible and what it says. We still stick to the Bible because it's the Word of God. But it does mean looking for opportunities, speaking in their language, being able to talk to them, caring about them in their own environment. You know, one of the things we see also is, as far as reaching out all things to all men, if we're not teaching people and reaching them with the real gospel, not prosperity gospel, not some other gospel, if we're not doing that, if we're not telling them, look, salvation isn't just a fire insurance card. It's not fire insurance. It's a changed life. It's a relationship. I should say it's a relationship where life changes from it. If we're not teaching that, we're teaching a worthless gospel. And again, I absolutely believe in salvation by faith alone. But is it really faith if there's no change in the person? You know, faith means acting on what you believe. And yet if you look at a lot of people, are they really acting on what they believe? If you want the best example, in my opinion, in the Bible, of what it means to reach the unsaved and teach the unsaved, go look at Mars Hill with Paul. Paul reached out to a totally foreign group of people. And we don't know how many converted. Maybe nobody did. We don't know. But he reached out to the Greeks in that case in a language they could understand, talking about their unknown God, and then bringing them back to the fact that the God that is unknown is the God you don't know, and it's Jesus Christ, and God the Father and the Holy Spirit, and you need to know Him. But you know something? He taught with them. He reasoned with them. If I remember correctly, he spent 2 or 3 days there at least, talking and reasoning. I haven't checked the story, but the point was he was teaching them the gospel. Sometimes we think unbelievers, all we have to do is tell them, believe on Christ, and we should tell them believe on Christ. But if they got questions, we need to answer them. And not only that, when we say believe on Christ, you know what the problem is? If they don't know who Christ was, they don't know what they're believing on. It's easy to believe on Christ if you believe Christ is a magic genie that all you got to do is put faith in Him and then you get all the things you want. A cosmic vending machine. That's not Jesus Christ, and that's not salvation. Salvation will bring about a changed life. And we can only do that with the true gospel. We can't do that with a gospel that we modify. Now, does that mean, again, with reaching out all things to all men? Absolutely, we have to look at ways to bring the gospel, ways to reach people, but never change the gospel itself. We can't afford to do that. Now we go to verses 24 to 27. Starting in 24, it says, "Do you not know that those who run a race, all race, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win." One of the things that I loved, I used to watch the Olympics years ago, and if you watched in, 2008 I think it was, Michael Phelps won 8 gold medals. And if you're a little bit older, you remember Mark Spitz, 72 was it, I think it was. And it's somewhere back in there, winning 7 gold medals in swimming, and it was amazing. But what amazed me the most, if you look at Phelps and Spitz, is that both of them didn't even train for it or didn't even show up at the Olympics. They just showed up at the Olympics and said, "Can I swim?" And the coach says, "Sure, grab a bathing suit." And they put him in and they won all these gold. No, of course not. We forget the fact that winning gold medals didn't start at that pool when they dove in the race. It started years and years before with sacrifice, training, dedication. Nobody shows up at the Olympics on the day of the Olympics and said, "Why don't you enter me in that event?" It doesn't work that way. And what Paul's pointing out here is there is a race going on, there is one prize to the winner, and if you're not training for it, you're not going to win it. You have to run to win. Now let me say this. This is not politically correct today to say this. But in life and in sports and in many other things, there are winners and there are losers. Now, when I say losers, I don't necessarily mean you're going to lose your salvation. But I do believe there are Christians where God looks down and says, yes, that person is doing what I want. He's following my will. And there's other Christians where God looks down, scratches his head, and says, why? Winners and losers. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we want to make it all politically correct and no, we're all doing whatever, we're all doing our own thing. No, there is a way that God wants you to be acting. Paul commands the Corinthians to run. He doesn't tell them, join the race if you feel like joining the race. And not only that, if God truly saved us, if Christ's blood was actually the propitiation for our sin, if our destiny was hell, and instead we have a relationship with God and then spend eternity in heaven, does God deserve any less than our best? Does God deserve any less than running that race to win? It should be the natural result of our salvation. Sometimes it isn't, but it should be. You know, one of the things that I remember when I was young, I've spoken to you before about playing sports, but I've never talked much about basketball. I had one skill in basketball that was amazing. I was able to be a lump. And in basketball terms, a lump is called setting a pick. The idea is when you set a pick, you put yourself in a spot where one of the opponents is going to run into you and then your guy can run by you. I was good at setting picks. That was the only thing I was good at in basketball. I remember standing in the gym at times, literally just by myself, standing under the basket, 3 feet away, taking 10 shots at the basket. Now I hit 3, I was lucky. I was a terrible shot, if I was close especially. You could shoot better for some reason when I was far away, but the point is, basketball was not my sport. Put me on a football field, a softball field, a baseball diamond, all of a sudden things changed around. Totally different thing there. But basketball, Now the reason I'm bringing this up is because every one of us, when it comes to this race Paul's talking about, has a different race. Paul didn't call you to win his race. You've got your own race, and I don't know what that race is. But there is no one in here who is a believer who should not be in the race or should be sitting on the sidelines. And when you find that race, that's the race you've got to run, and that's the race you've got to win. We're not competing against the fact, for example, saying there's only one winner. It doesn't mean, gee, if you're not doing one particular job in the church, you're a waste to God. It doesn't mean I've got to be better than Kyle or Eric or whoever else. The point is, it doesn't work that way. That's not what we're saying. I'm saying you have a race, whoever you are if you're a believer. Find that race and win that race because God has called you to that race. He has a mission for you. And something else, that mission may be standing in a pulpit, but the odds are it's probably not. It may be teaching a Sunday school class, but if you look at the total numbers, the odds are it's probably not. But you know something? You ever seen what happens in an army? Like take World War II, for example. And an army gets overstretched and cut off from the supply lines. And they don't pay attention to the supply lines. How long do you think an army lasts without food? You give it about 3 days and the fighting ability of that army is gone. Period. One of the ways to win a war is to cut off supply lines. The reason I bring this up is you may be in a support role. That support role is every bit as important as the out on the front role. How long do you think the U.S. Army would have lasted in World War II or World War I without cooks? You get the idea, don't you? It's all critical. And each one of us has a role. Each one of us has a race. We need to find that race for each one of us and then win that race. But it's not just winning a race, because if we look at verses 25, or start reading 25, it says, and everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. Then they do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. The first thing we notice here is exercises self-control. What's he talking about? He's talking about discipline. He's talking about training. There's no one that goes into a race who just says, I'm going to show up and win today if it's a big race. It doesn't work that way. I don't care what sport you play in, you have to train for that sport if you get to a professional level. Period. It doesn't work otherwise. That self-control is what prepares us for the race, and it's self-control to stay dedicated while you're in that race. You know something? If you've ever participated in sports at a high level, you know what I mean. At certain times, there's physical pain you endure and go through. Whether it's pain even breathing, whether it's pain from getting hit, whether it's pain for whatever, okay? I remember being about 8 years old and taking a softball right off my skull from about 40 feet away when an adult hit it into my face. You know something? That was pain. But the point is, when we have that pain, play through that pain. Now, sports, it's easy to say that, and that's a sports metaphor, but I'm talking about every believer, every race, and hopefully you're not going to get hit in the face with a softball by somebody, okay? It hurts. It really does. Especially when it's your dad that does it, and well, let me say this. My dad was massive compared to me. And when he hit a ball, yeah. So anyway, it nearly took my head off. So hopefully you won't have to go through that. But you're going to face challenges, I guarantee it. What Paul's saying is self-control, endurance, discipline. That's how you're going to get through it. Have you ever thought about the fact that everything you do in your life relates to the race and relates to the mission? Everything. It's either supporting it or hindering it. Sometimes we don't think about that. And the other thing Paul says in this verse in 25 is that we are going for an imperishable reward, not a perishable one. You know something? Many of us probably have boxes of trophies sitting in our basements that we won in high school or junior high or college or whatever. You know something? Eventually, those trophies are going to burn up. It may take 100 years or 1,000 years or whatever, but eventually this earth is going to burn up and those trophies are going to go with it. They're not going to last. They're perishable. We're never going to lose the trophies that God gives us. Now, if we read on to 26 and 27, therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in a way as not beating the air, and I buffet my body and make it my slave, lest possibly, after I have preached to others, I should be disqualified. Number one, he needed aim and purpose. And anyone who's going to run a race, you, me, or whatever, we need an aim and a purpose. If we don't have that, we're not going to make the race. In addition to that, remember, Paul's already said we are slaves. A slave will let nothing stand in his way to accomplish the task because he's listening to what the master says to do. Each one of us that's a believer is a slave to Christ. And I think the third thing Paul's saying in this verse is, and I don't mean to parrot the movie Untouchables, but never stop. He doesn't want to lead others to Christ, to help others to teach, and then fall away himself. It's a race to the end of your life, period. It's not a race. You know something? Not one of us did God ever call to be a rip-roaring Christian leading people to the Lord and teaching and serving meals and everything else until we're 47, and then at 47, now take the rest of your life off and stand and do what you want. It doesn't work that way. It's till the day we die and then we continue in heaven. It doesn't stop. And that's what Paul's saying here is, I don't want to be in the point where I'm looked at as someone who quit before I got to the end or disqualified myself. Now let's talk about the application for all this. Number one, you often hear the word sacrificing for Christ. I was going to say I don't want to belittle or mock things here, but actually, yes, I do want to belittle and mock things here, just for a moment. And I'm not pointing at any individual, okay? Sometimes I hear people talking about sacrificing for Christ. And I mean, it's almost like, yeah, I got a hangnail or a paper cut or whatever. Or it's like, I'm sacrificing for Christ. I went out and acted like a total jerk and insulted some people, and now they're upset at me because I shared the gospel with them. No, they're upset at you because you're a jerk. I don't mean anybody here personally, okay? And I've probably done that too, where you go out and maybe you're not the nicest person when you're witnessing. That's not what it's talking about with sacrificing for Christ. Most of us in our culture do not know what sacrifice is. There are people dying right now for Christ. The odds are in the next hour or two, someone in the world will be dead because of Jesus Christ. Every hour, every day. When we talk about sacrificing, I don't mean we need to look for persecution either. But we need to be willing to do whatever it takes to do what God wants us to do in accomplishing our mission. And the first thing we have to realize is sacrificing for Christ is not an accident. It requires a plan. It requires time. It is a true sacrifice. You're going to sacrifice for Christ when you actually plan out what you're going to do. It's also not just a Sunday morning thing. I already gave God 2 hours on Sunday. What more does He want? How many football players in the NFL do you think show up only on Sundays and never go to practice, never study playbooks or anything else? They don't last very long if they try that. They're out of the league. Sacrificing may also require us stretching our boundaries. You know something? There are things that sometimes we're simply not comfortable doing. I've been put in that spot many times, and it's funny. Sometimes I find when I stretch my boundaries, that's really where God wanted me, and it's the biggest internal reward for doing that. But sometimes you're going to have to do things that maybe aren't comfortable. Maybe it's a little socially awkward to go to somebody who's your friend and say, look, we've been friends for a while, but I want to know, do you know Christ as your Savior? Not only that, sometimes you talk about awkward. How about people that are in your church and you go, boy, has that person really become a believer? And I'm not even thinking here. Sometimes you meet Christians and you start realizing, maybe they're not really a Christian. And I'm not saying we need to be judges here, but as a friend caring enough to say, I'm going to stretch my boundaries and I'm going to ask them to find out or try to help them. And that's only one example. Whatever it is, we have to be willing to go above and beyond our comfort zone to sacrifice for Christ, whatever that comfort zone is. In addition to that, with sacrificing for Christ, I have a question for you right here. What is your personal plan for Jesus Christ? What are you planning on doing? Today? This week? This month? This year? 5 years from now? 10 years from now? You know, there are things that we can do, yes, on the spot, but there's a lot of things we've got to plan for. If you want to get a degree and teach in the Bible college or something like that, you don't just walk up and say, I've seen the Bible. No, you actually go and study and get your degrees and plan it out and work for it. And it takes time. It's not something that just happens. I don't care if you're a teacher. I don't care if you're supervising potluck dinners. I don't care if you're a person who simply encourages people or whatever else it is you're doing. Every one of us should have a plan for what we're doing for Jesus Christ. You ever hear the expression, if you don't know where you're going, you'll get there? It's true. Wherever you end up, that's where I was going. That's not the way it works. We need to be, and I'm not saying those plans don't get adjusted by God at times, but we need to have a plan for saying, where are we going? We need to think in terms almost like a business would. And I don't mean to turn this into something which is just a simple business model. But the truth is, there are principles that should be applied to our lives that we don't apply. Because think about it. How many times have you thought to yourself, there are people, I've done it myself, where you're going, okay, we got a plan to buy this house. We got to save this. We got to get everything in line. And you know what you're doing. And it may take 6 months, or it may take a year, it may take 10 years. You have plans for your career. You have plans if you want to have children. You have all these plans set out. Have you ever sat down and said, what is my plan for honoring God in the next 5 years? What is my plan for honoring God in the next 10 years? Every one of us should have that. Every one. The next month, the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. And just take this home with you. What is your personal plan for Jesus Christ? The other thing I want to talk about here is rejoicing in the work of Christ. One of the things that I did back years ago, I bought an AMC Concorde. That was a phenomenal car. I'm being sarcastic here. I will say this, it was very dependable. And I do believe I could have taken that car and driven it right through a brick wall and maybe got a few scratches on the paint and that's it. But that was not a car that you wanted to cruise on to show, for example, the single women, look how cool I am, okay? The AMC Concorde was about as cool as a wart on your nose, okay? Yet one of the most satisfying things I did was with that Concorde. And you know what it was? I bought the car for $300. I didn't have any more money. I was broke. And after I bought the car, I realized there was some serious problems with the engine. It was leaking smoke, it was doing other things. And I got a Chilton manual, and I forget who the other company was. I got 2 manuals, and I tore the entire engine apart and rebuilt that whole thing, put all new gaskets in, got everything done in it, and reassembled the engine. And you know something? That moment when I turned the key and heard, boom, oh, wow. There was a satisfaction there. Now, I did have to take it up to a mechanic to do one thing. I misconnected one of the tubes for recirculating air, and therefore it was kind of, not running smoothly. But as soon as you took that one rubber tube and moved it to another spot, all of a sudden, that engine was running beautifully. There's a satisfaction in doing the work for Christ, just like that car. There is an internal satisfaction you're going to get. The work is the reward. We're built to work. Sometimes we forget that. And God will reward you too, I believe, but the work itself is the reward. Now, the other thing too is, while you're working for Christ, you have two choices. You can enjoy it, or you can not enjoy it. That may sound stupid, but it's true. Our attitude will change how we are rewarded. If you want to do something and enjoy it, even with computer networking, I can look at that as, it's a business and I've got to do it, or I can look at it as, hey, that's cool. Earlier in the week, I got a call from Caleb, and he's like, you got to hear what I just found and what I just did. And I did have to hear it. It was really cool. He solved a problem that most people wouldn't have solved. Now, admittedly, he gets a financial reward too, but the point is that is the reward of doing the work. I also want to talk about one more thing, and that is question to each person in this audience. Are you running to win? That's what this whole message boils down to is, are you running to win? Every one of us has an obligation to share the gospel. Every one of us has an obligation in some form or another to teach. Even if it's not the words, we have some teaching and sharing to do with each other. Every one of us has an obligation to live a holy life. If you're a believer, then you have an obligation to live a holy life. It's not optional. It's not like, I'll see about that if I feel like it this week. Now, right at the moment I've talked about our obligations to God, but where it really gets tough isn't identifying the obligations, it's how do we do this? I'll admit to you, it's not the easiest thing, and I fail all the time at this. The thing is, I do keep getting back up. But we're going to fail. So how do we do it? First thing, and the first thing you have to remember, is setting priorities. Easy to get overwhelmed. In life, we've got too many things to do. I don't care who you are, you probably have too many things to do. I know I do. We have to set priorities with our time. We have to set priority with our energies. We have to set priority with our emotions. Sometimes we can burn ourselves out if we're not looking closely. And you know something? Sometimes we burn ourselves out, and then we look back and go, wow, I burned myself out, and none of that was even worthwhile, and none of that's going to matter at all for eternity, is it? I don't think even God wants us to burn out on His work, but the point is, I think we've got to prioritize what we're doing. Set goals. Again, what is your personal plan for Christ? And then once you set the goals, align the priorities to the goals. It may sound simple, but it's not. But it does work. How many people do you think make the NFL by sleeping all days and eating nothing but Snickers bars? I'm willing to try it, but no. The point being is, you don't get in the pros that way. Why should we think it's any different with the spiritual life when all we're doing is eating cotton candy as far as Bible study, when we're not looking at a holy life? I don't mean personal, I'm not identifying anybody here, but the point is, if it applies to you, take it. If it doesn't, smile. I'm glad it doesn't. But if we're not living a holy life, if we're not studying the Word of God, and instead we're just eating fluff that we might get off of some televangelist or something, if we're doing all these various things to not train and to be lazy, why would we expect the result to turn out as winner of the race? We're not going to win a race that way. It takes training, it takes setting priorities, it takes making a plan and putting that plan into action. I cannot tell you what your personal plan is, but I can tell you God wants you to have one. And I'll also tell you that as you start acting more in line with God wants, sometimes you'll find your desires change. So have you ever started reading the Bible and after a while, oh wow, I missed it today because I didn't read it? Things like that. Our desires can change to match our actions, and that goes both ways. It can also go the other way. If we're not living a holy life and we just decide to do whatever we want and we're not serving God, our desires and our actions will end up matching each other there as well. I want to leave you with one thing. Each believer in this room, including me, has a choice to make. Are you going to run to win or not? And if you're not, don't fake it. Just say, hey, I'm not going to bother. That's fine. That's your choice. I shouldn't say it's fine, but that's your choice. But are you going to decide it's time for me to be serious and run to win, to establish a plan, to set the priorities with that plan, to set goals, and those goals lead to Jesus Christ? Let's go ahead and pray.